Hey guys, it's Alyssa from Pile of Fabric. Today I will be sharing how I made my Sweet Home Arizona quilt. The templates for this quilt can be downloaded at my blog, and I'll include a link in the description. Even if you don't live in Arizona, you could apply the idea and techniques in this tutorial to your own state or country. The Sweet Home Arizona Quilt is an easy 1 out of 4 on the Pile of Fabric difficulty scale. Tools and supplies used: 34-inch by 34-inch piece of 100% cotton batting, 25.5 by 30-inch and 8-inch by 21-inch piece of Pellin Wonder Under fusible web, Sweet Home Arizona templates printed on 100% on 8.5 by 11 copy paper, an iron and pressing board, 40 weight top stitching quilting thread, I used Aurifil, a 90/14 top stitch needle, embroidery floss in a contrasting color to your quilt, and a self-threading needle. Fabric used: in order to make one 30-inch finished size Sweet Home Arizona quilt using raw edge applique, you will need the following. For the state, you will need 10 2.5-inch by 30-inch pieces of fabric. I used Kona cotton in salmon, primrose, dusty rose, amethyst, bright berry, ocean, Pacific, avocado, pea pod, wasabi, and I used about 1/8 yard of each of those. For the background, you'll need a 31-inch by 31-inch piece of fabric. I used Kona cotton in nautical. For the cactus, you'll need an 8-inch by 21-inch piece of fabric. I used Kona cotton in nautical again. For the quilt backing, you'll need a 36-inch by 36-inch piece of fabric. I used a butterfly fabric by Lizzie House. For the solid binding, you could use 4 2.5-inch by width of fabric strips of solid fabric. I used Kona cotton in nautical. And if you want to add some cool stripes to your binding, you'll need 3 2.5-inch by width of fabric strips of that nautical or solid color fabric, and 10 2.5-inch by 4-inch pieces of fabric for the stripes. Sewing machines used: for the quilting and piecing, I used my Juki 2010Q sewing machine. For the blanket stitch top stitching, I used an Eversewn Sparrow 20. Preparing the templates: I have printed the Sweet Home Arizona templates on copy paper at 100%, no scale. I am trimming, piecing, and taping the pieces together. I cut out the state of Arizona. I cut out the cactus. Cutting the fabrics: I have already starched and pressed all of my fabric to prepare for cutting. Starching your fabric before cutting will help stabilize the bias edges of the fabric, giving you greater accuracy when you're piecing. It also helps the seams to lay flatter and crisper. I'm cutting out all my pieces. Piecing and fusing the applique. With a 1/4-inch seam allowance, I sew the first 2 strips together along the lengthwise edge. Then I line up the third strip and sew. I will keep adding strips until all 10 are sewn together. I finger press the seam allowances open, then press the seam allowance with my iron. I press from the right side of the block as well to make sure the seams are nice and flat. I lay the stripped block wrong side up and the fusible web bumpy side down onto the block. Most brands of fusible web are only 20 inches wide, so you will likely need to cut more than one piece of fusible web to cover the wrong side of the stripped block. I use a steamy hot iron and press the paper side of the fusible web to fuse it to the striped block. I will leave the paper on for now. I lay the striped block wrong side, paper side up onto my cutting mat. I turn it at a 30-degree angle using the lines on my mat as a guide. I position the state template wrong side up over the top of the striped block and trace around the template. I cut out the state of Arizona on my markings. I lay the fabric for the cactus wrong side up and the fusible web bumpy side down onto the fabric. I use a steamy hot iron and press the paper side of the fusible web to fuse it to the fabric. I lay the cactus template on top of the paper side of the fusible and trace the cactus. I cut out the cactus applique. I lay the striped State of Arizona block right side up on my cutting mat. I remove the paper backing for the cactus. I use the State of Arizona template to help me properly position the cactus. I pin the cactus in place. At my pressing board, I use a steamy hot iron and press the cactus to fuse it into place. I remove the paper backing from the back of the State of Arizona block. I lay the 31-inch by 31-inch piece of background fabric right side up on my pressing board. I position the State of Arizona fusible side down on the top of the background. I press the State of Arizona with a steamy hot iron to fuse it to the background fabric. Top stitching the applique. Using a blanket stitch on my Eversewn machine, I top stitch around all edges of the State of Arizona and cactus. I leave my thread tails long. Using a self-threading needle, I pull the thread tails to the back of the quilt. I knot them and trim them. Basting the quilt. I lay my backing wrong side up. I lay my 100% cotton batting centered over the backing. Usually for a quilt this small, I spray baste the layers. But I was all out of spray based, so I decided to thread baste the quilt instead. I am using a self-threading needle and 3 strands of bright, contrasting colored embroidery floss. I cut a piece of floss about 18 inches long. I pull out 3 strands from the skein, and I thread it onto my self-threading needle. I do not knot the end of the floss. Starting in the bottom right corner, I make a 1/2 inch stitch, pulling my thread almost to the tail of the thread but not all the way through the quilt. I place my hand above the stitch as a guide, and I take another 1/2 inch stitch above my hand, pulling the floss taut. I use my hand again as a guide for spacing and take another 1/2 inch stitch above my hand, pulling the floss taut. I continue this process, working my way to the top of the quilt. This is called a herringbone basting stitch. When I get close to the end of the floss, I grab a new 18-inch 3-strand piece of floss and thread the needle, and I continue. When I get to the top of the quilt, I move to the left about a hand width and work my way down the quilt in the same way. I will continue this process until my whole quilt is thread basted. Machine quilting the quilt. I have placed a long piece of blue painter's tape at the same angle of the stripes in the state, across the center of my quilt. I used this tape as a straight edge guide for my first line of quilting. I have my juki set up with a walking foot and a guide bar, and the guide bar is going to be set to about a 1.5 inch spacing. I have my machine stitch length set to about 4.5, and I'm using a 40 weight thread with a 90/14 top stitching needle. If I come to a piece of embroidery floss, I trim it out of the way and keep going. I line the guide bar on my walking foot up with the first line of quilting and continue to sew. I quilt off the edge of the quilt, cut my thread, and start the next line of quilting. Binding the quilt. Using a rotary cutter and ruler, I trim off the excess batting and check that my quilt is square. Now I will join my binding strips into one long piece. I lay one fabric strip on my cutting mat right side up. I lay a second fabric strip right side down and line it up with the corner of the first strip. The two strips now create a right angle. Using a ruler, I find the center diagonal of the two strips and cut 1/2 inch to the right. I pin the two strips together. I lay the end of the second strip right side up on my mat, and I lay a third fabric strip right side down and line it up with the corner of the second strip. Using a ruler, I find the center diagonal on the two strips and cut 1/2 inch to the right. I pin the strips together. I lay the end of the third strip right side up on my mat. I lay my first 2.5 inch by 4 inch stripe piece right side down and line it up with the corner of the third strip. Now I cut the top right corner of all 9 striped pieces off and move to my sewing machine. At my sewing machine, using a 1/2 inch seam allowance, I sew along the edges of the 2 striped pieces. I trim the seam allowance and keep adding stripe pieces. I sew the rest of the binding joints. I press the seam allowances to one side. I fold the binding in half lengthwise and press. With my quilt right side up, I line up the raw edge of the binding with the raw edge of the quilt and I clip. At the corner, I fold the binding upward, creating a 45-degree angle fold and a right angle. I fold the binding back downward along the next edge of the quilt. I continue to clip the binding to the quilt. If I was making a larger quilt, I would most likely glue baste my binding instead of clipping. The beginning of where I clipped the binding onto the quilt, I let the end of the binding hang over the start of the binding by 1/2 inch and I trim off the excess. I open up the two ends of the binding, matching them right sides together. I sew them together with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. I finger press the seam to one side and lay the binding back down along the edge of the quilt and clip. I wasn't able to show this in the video because my video didn't turn out, but here's an image to help you. I sewed the binding in place with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. When I got to a corner, I folded the 45-degree angle flap out of the way and sewed slowly until I was directly in the crease line of the angle. I stopped with my needle down. With my needle in down position, I rotated the quilt and sewed off the edge. Then I rotated my quilt and started on the next edge of the quilt. I folded the 45-degree angle flap back upward out of the way. I started stitching directly from the crease and I sewed down the side of the quilt. I sewed the corners this way every time. After I sew the binding to the quilt, I like to serge the raw edges. I fold the binding around the edge to the back of the quilt and clip it in place. In the corners, I create a 45-degree miter and continue clipping. With my quilt front side up, using a size 3.5 stitch length, I sew in the ditch where the binding and quilt meet. Every so often, I stop and check the back side of the quilt to make sure I'm catching the edge of the binding as I sew. Thank you for spending your time with me as I made the Sweet Home Arizona Quilt. If you like this tutorial, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel for more sewing tutorials.